Hi, Stitchers. Welcome to Tatreez Talk, where we share conversations about Palestinian embroidery. I'm Lena, here with my co-host Amani, chatting with talented embroiderers and artists, sharing their stories, inspirations, and the cultural significance behind their work.
On today's episode, we're chatting with Razan, a diasporic Palestinian researcher, community worker, and Tatreez facilitator based out of Toronto. She works from Indigenous and Palestinian feminist methodologies to consider the relationships, material cultures, and joint resistances between Palestinian and Indigenous communities engaging in collective world building on Turtle Island. Welcome to Tatreez Talk, Razan.
Hi, everyone. Lena,
Yeah.
Manny, a pleasure, an honor. So excited to be here.
No, it is
We are,
our pleasure. Actually, I was telling Amani,
yes.
I think like a month before were recording this, I was in Toronto with Razan and literally learning Indigenous art forms together in community with other Indigenous communities within, Canada. And it was such a joy to just be and feel safe and have these conversations without being interrupted. So I knew after that session, I really wanted to bring you onto the podcast because you're doing some incredible research. You're doing some incredible work in general. And I'm just really excited for the broader Tiltrees community to hear all about it and hopefully also engage and participate with you. So thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to be on here. And it was so lovely. Like, I do have to say, seeing you in person after like years of like, since the pandemic, we connected
Yeah.
virtually. So it was so cool. It was like, whoa, you're a person in front of me right now.
I know, I know, I
Yeah,
know. It's so different. It's so different,
so
the
different.
in-person
Yeah.
experience, 100%. Well, Razan, let's kick off then. We always like to ask our guests about you and your family's connections to Palestine. Would you mind sharing?
Yeah, of course. So on my dad's side, because this is how it goes, they're actually from Beit Imrien. And my mom's side is from Einhod, which is like a much smaller village. Beit Imrien is in the Nablus government. And it's so interesting because I feel like this is the part maybe in some people's stories where they talk about their grandmother stitching or like a history of like matriarchs in the family stitching. I come from regions where like Tatreezing was not as commonly practiced, mostly like agricultural workers. Very little time with the sun to be able to actually Tatreez. So yeah, so my connections to my family and to Palestine, to land, it's so interesting because Tatreez has been such a strong like medium and force in my life to connect back to the places where my family is from. And at the same time, it's like taking it up like with my mom and like learning it together in the diaspora as like informed very heavily like the way that we connect back to our roots.
And what was your relationship to Tatreez growing up? Since, you, as you said, you don't come from a region where Tatreez is really practiced, but was it something that you saw in your life? Was it something that your family like participated in other ways beyond like actually creating Tatreez?
Yeah, I think it's a story that's really common amongst a lot of diasporic Palestinians. We see it in our homes, TWAB. Like I was familiar with it from an aesthetic standpoint, but growing up, I didn't know what it meant, what goes into the technique, the labor, the love, the time, the energy, and the stories. And so what ended up happening was during the pandemic, um, I started just questioning everything. And my mom and I actually were spending so much more time than usual inside with one another. And the topic came up. When I started researching it, I couldn't find much about Tatreez. But at that time, a lot of like rare and vintage bookstores were actually putting their stock online because they were closing their doors. So suddenly I actually had access to print material, being able to purchase it online, ship it to where I live in Toronto, and read about Tatreez for the very first time. And that was something that was really, really special. My mom learned it in high school as part of like crafts making. It was very typical growing up in Jordan as a kid. And I know it's quite common in the Arab world in general. So she knew like the basics, and then with the books and her basic knowledge, a couple YouTube channels, we were able to figure it out, and here we are many years later.
That's so cool. So what were those print materials that you got?
Yeah, so there was, oh my gosh, there's Layla Khalidi's book, was one of the very first ones that I read, which is a very text-heavy book.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
barely
it
has
is.
any
Yeah.
pictures. Um, and then there was a book, I wish I had them because a friend is actually borrowing them right now. Um, but there's oh my goodness, I'm forgetting his name. It's a Palestinian,
Nabil and Nani.
not that one. I actually
Okay.
have only seen virtual versions of this one.
Yeah.
It's the one on Palestinian costume and jewelry is the English title.
Okay. Oh,
Yeah.
I don't know if I know that one. We'll have to dig it up.
We'll have to dig it up. I can send you some pictures. I wish I had them with me right now. But yeah,
Yeah.
a friend is borrowing them. And then also I very early on got access to like Sinbala's book. There was the
This,
short kind of storytelling book, but then they also had the 17 embroidery techniques. That one was really helpful, especially with like the step by step and then opening up the world to way more than the cross stitch.
yeah.
Um, yeah, so I think those were like the most influential books. And then eventually splurged on We Dead War's Threads of Identity, which is my favorite book. The newer text.
Yeah. It's a favorite for a lot of people.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. I love that you were able to kind of dive in and read a little bit more about the trees, and I'm sure that that really inspired a lot of your work and like the work that you're doing now. And you talked, and even before we started recording, we were talking a lot about the work that you are doing between Palestinian and Indigenous like movements and world building, as you call it. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, what does that mean, and how has that like work really been shaped by the creative work you're doing with the trees?
Yeah. I think as someone who, like, I grew up in the city and I grew up very acutely aware, despite living in a very heavily Arab diaspora and living in probably one of the most populous, like, Palestinian communities in North America, there's still this kind of feeling of non-belonging. And then when you start to interrogate that, especially from a critical lens, you quickly come to realize that it's because you're also as an Indigenous person, you're rooted to land, and you're not when you're far away from your homelands, you're displaced and you're dispossessed from your homelands, but then you're living in a settler colonial state. So then there's this contradiction. And even as a kid, I was aware of these things, the ways that Native people and Indigenous people were erased in like our school curricula. Um, there's different threads that I picked up on that felt like I saw myself, kind of like mirrors and reflections and windows into all of these histories and present realities that I saw myself as a Palestinian in them, but couldn't necessarily place them because we weren't being taught by Indigenous people. And Indigenous literatures and knowledges were not something that was part of my day to day. So growing up, I've started doing a lot of that work myself, whether it's like reading Indigenous authors, poetry is a really big one. And then eventually, when I graduated from university and started working in the social sector, I was working with a lot of nonprofits that were resettling refugees. This question kind of came up again, like we're doing resettlement work in the settler state. And then once again, Indigenous people are completely missing from that picture and from that education that we were using in order to help people acclimatize to living here. And at the same time, me feeling all kinds of ways about living here. So that's when I really turned even more to showing up to Indigenous protests and rallies. And then you start to realize there's a lot of really beautiful like art making practices that are also rooted in the same kinds of values and principles that we as Palestinians also engage in. And so all these little pieces started coming together, like the work that I was doing with refugees, but then going into graduate school for community development and very purposefully like only taking courses with Indigenous scholars because those are the people I wanted to learn from. And then realizing that Indigenous like methodologies, knowledge systems, perspectives are really great at framing the Palestinian experience. And Palestinians are also doing this work, and it's wonderful. But I think we have so much to learn from Indigenous scholars as well, and community activists and land defenders on how they do this work as well. Um, and so, yeah, and I think that's kind of also where over the last couple of years being more diligent as a Palestinian living on stolen lands. What are my responsibilities to being on this land? And our activism to our people in Palestine and our artwork commemorating that resistance and being in itself an act of resistance, like sitting here in Tatreez to me is like defiance to the settler state. It's like, I am here picking up this Indigenous craft and I'm doing it despite the odds being lands and waters away. Um, it's so powerful, but it's even more powerful, I feel, when you're doing it in community with people that are also so heavily involved in imagining a decolonial future and working towards different ways to achieve liberation, not just for Palestinians, but also for Indigenous people here in the lands where we are, because it's all connected. It's all intertwined. And so, in the same way that um, settler colonialism and states and empire work and conspire together in order to oppress us, we can also work together in order to liberate us.
That is so powerful. It's yeah, and it's something that we it's interesting because I feel like Tatreez and the conversations that I've been having over the last, year on this podcast, but just more generally because of the spaces that I'm having getting access to through Tatreez, like I was never really that aware of Indigenous communities local to me. And I feel like that is something that has like Tatreez has kind of opened that door and it's just so wild because like what's happening in Palestine isn't like the first time in history, like this has been happening for centuries by the powers at play. And I think what we're getting better at is each movement learns from the previous movements and then takes it a step further. And I think what you're talking through is ultimately, hopefully we can actually see it through all the way to full liberation for everybody, not just Palestinians, but the entire world. So I have two questions for you. One, because I struggle with this, it's kind of more of a personal question. I'm going to use the time to ask you. I feel like over the last year as well, I've been kind of, I like the word interrogate that you used, interrogating my own like definitions of what is resistance and where does Tatreez play a role in that. And I really, I'm actually struggling these days to like allow for nuance in that word because to me like when I hear the word resist or resistance, it's like to me that's a very powerful word and I feel like I'm too privileged to use that word in the capacity that I'm practicing Tatreez. So I'm curious to hear kind of your take on that and then as like I guess a natural segue off of that kind of conversation, I'm curious about like where does Tatreez play the role in resistance? You kind of talked a little bit through it, but would love to hear more about kind of what does that actually look like, and more than just like a concept.
Yeah, this is such an important question, and I think about it every day. There's that guilt that we carry as Palestinians in the diaspora, right? But I think resistance comes in so many different forms, and we can I all confidently say that like land defense and resistance on the front line is the most important. That is the front that is um, pushing the limits for all of us to be able to participate in our different forms of resistance. So there's that, right? But and then the different ways and how is Tatreez like a form of resistance? I see it as one, like I mentioned earlier, it's that defiance. Like despite all odds, there is a way for us to continue traditional practices and be ready for when liberation is around. And I'll be throwing in a lot of like indigenous feminist like scholars work where they've very heavily written about all of this stuff, and I feel and shared stories and family stories and not just things in literature that I think as Palestinians we can really learn from. And so one thing is thinking about, for example, the consequences of residential schools. And so indigenous children were uh, who were forced into residential schools, or in Canada, we had something called the 60s scoop, where children were taken away from their family after the wave of the residential schools. Sometimes these children came back to their family, but they didn't have the language anymore. They didn't have a way of connecting with their mothers and grandmothers. And so when they sit together and then they're engaging in whether it's weaving or it's beading or it's stitching, or it's basket making, whatever it is, that became their language. And so suddenly, like the the all of these interventions on indigenous communities where settler society has tried so hard to annihilate indigenous people, to genocide indigenous people, to erase our culture and our ways of being and our ways of knowing and being in relationship to one another. It's so incredible how we can still find practices like Tatreez, like beading, in order to rebuild all of that. And so, yes, it's a material practice and it's a cultural practice, and we feel guilty because it's art and we're made to feel guilty about art. But when we start to think about it as, well, how does Tatreez help me have a conversation with the elders in my family? How can Tatreez help me connect with my family or my chosen family? How do I learn more about the landscape of Palestine, the birds, the flora, the fauna, the food through Tatreez? That is incredibly powerful. And because it's so rooted in centuries of history, nothing could erase that, right? Looking at a thobe is looking at lifetimes of stories of people. And I think I'll end off with why my research trajectory kind of ended up leaning towards Tatreez. I see Tatreez as a really worthwhile mode of inquiry. It's an intellectual endeavor. It is not easy to Tatreez. It is not easy to tell stories through intricate patterns and shapes and colors. And yet, women for generations have done it. And because of the way like Western science works and knowledge production work, all of all of these ways of generating stories and generating knowledge end up being reduced down to just women's craft in a more domestic domain. And so they're
Mhm.
not actually seen as intellectual sites of struggle, but they are. And even from all the different topics you've hosted in your podcast, or the most recent one around like appropriation of Tatreez and the way it's co-opted by Zionists in the settler state, that
Mhm.
makes Tatreez a site of struggle. That is a front that we fight as well. And it's just as important because I think people have different skills to contribute to the overall cause. And so if this is something that you're really passionate about and you're really good at it and you want to do it, it's better than not doing something. I think we need
Yeah.
people at all fronts when it comes to the Palestinian cause. Tatreez and cultural resistance definitely being one of them.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for, oh my God, I have so many, I might have too many follow-up questions. So let me like focus in on one of the first things that you said that like really resonated with me was how you're talking about the fact that these is kind of this language that can connect and similar to as you were discussing your local Indigenous communities and what happened in Canada with these residential schools and how these these children came back to their families and were able to really connect through art, through traditional crafts. That's something that I think for me personally is the area of Tetris I've found the most joy in through this podcast, through our like global social media community, if you will, through these retreats that we've done, is being able to connect with people that I may have never connected with in any other way, but Tatreez is the thing that connects us. And it's so cool and it's so powerful. And, you know, you're talking a lot about the work that you're doing locally and how you've been able to connect with local indigenous communities of the land that you are living on. What would you say to somebody who, whether they're Palestinian or non-Palestinian, they're just an ally who lives on stolen land and wants to connect deeper to the local indigenous communities and wants to support, how would you recommend that they get involved and that they use their practice and their Tatreez community to connect, and support each other's struggles?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked this question because I feel like it's on us, like as Palestinians, to like call in our
Mhm.
Palestinians and be like,
Yeah.
hey, like this is an area we're maybe lacking in a little bit. Let's think of some creative ways to like engage in relationship building. Um, and from like the Tatreez side of things, I feel like one way is the Tatreez circles themselves. I'm very intentional about the way that Tatreez circles, sorry, I'm intentional about the curriculum that I create for Tatreez circles, as well as the way that it's promoted and who I am creating the space for. So oftentimes, most of the time, I do Tatreez circles that are maybe just for Palestinian Indigenous folks, or maybe like Palestinian Black Indigenous folks, racialized folks. Like I play around in the back end of the Eventbrite. All right, there's like a
Mm.
little ally section if you don't fit all the box. That's cool. We love our allies.
Mm.
But it's really important in my opinion to intentionally create like welcoming spaces where Palestinians, Indigenous, and Black folks can encounter one another. Um, I find that like in the area where I live, I used to live in Toronto. I live now in Mississauga, which is out on the suburbs of the Toronto area. We live in relatively segregated neighborhoods. Like growing up, I mostly saw Arab and brown kids. Like I didn't see anyone else. And going with my parents, like there's comfort levels there. It's not necessarily bad. It's actually really good in the sense that like I'm so glad I had access to cultural foods and my language and I know Arabic and all these things. But it's not great when you're trying to really expand your worldviews and recognizing that the struggle is real for all of these communities. And Indigenous and Black communities in particular have been fighting the struggle in North America for much longer than we have. So we have so much to learn from them. So yes, intentionally creating space where your Tatreez circle is calling and soliciting folks that are maybe engaged in community organizing. So it's a healing space for them. Those folks, you know, the ones organizing the protests, the ones organizing mutual aid, are probably the least likely to have a moment to slow down and to sit and tell trees. And so that's been part of also the work that I do, where I am tapping into organizing communities and trying to offer that space to slow down from the day-to-day chaos of being an organizer. Um, I think also supporting like mutual aid campaigns that support Indigenous people in our local communities is really important. And to tap into that, it's really about making sure you're educated about like what grassroots organizations exist. And some places have them more than others. So it's very place specific. Um, and there's many different ways to like engage with people, just like you would with any community. But I've been finding that like working at the grassroots level, working with or adjacent to protest organizers, has been really fruitful and has been like a really beautiful space to do that. And the other thing is that land defense, like on Turtle Island in North America, is very real. It is very real. There is a huge history of land defense. There's a huge present. There are pipelines that are being fought right now. There are nuclear facilities. There are different struggles with like water contamination and safe water access all over. North America. Not too long ago, you have Standing Rock in 2016, a very active site of struggle where Palestinians were also present there. But it took organized efforts by namely the Palestinian the Palestinian Youth Movement, to name one organization. Like it took effort to organize young people to go
Yeah.
physically and be at a site of land defense. I think that's really, really important. And then you can bring Tatreez there too, right? You can cook
Yes.
together, you can Tatreez together, you can sit in ceremony together, you can share stories, you can hear from people and really build those relationships. Um, and I think I've offered maybe like a range here of things that can happen in all kinds of different settings. Um, but there's something really special about being at a site of land defense, I would say, or visiting those sites. I've had opportunities in my life where I've gotten to celebrate land being returned to Indigenous people, and it's so joyous and beautiful. And that's where you live out in the Bay Area, Amani. Like shout out
Yeah.
Celebrity Land Trust. It is so cool. They do the
Yeah.
shell mound to shell mound walk because they're trying to get the shell mounds back, and then they get one of them back, and there's Palestine flags. There's
Hmm.
Palestine flags everywhere, and they're commemorating it in the celebration. We got our land back, and then there's Palestine flags because Palestine will also be free. So I think there's a lot you can do. Look out for the land defense happening in your area. Join it and bring Tatreez
Hmm.
there, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, you're gonna make me cry. It's so beautiful. But before we started recording, and you just mentioned, like, we talked a little bit about the Bay Area and the art community here and the social justice community, the genuine, like, just collaborative work that happens across communities. And I will say, like, I'm very spoiled to have grown up in the Bay Area, and very honored that, the Indigenous community here, and I will say the Asian American community here, the Black community here, the Latinx community here, they have always, always, always stood in solidarity with us as Palestinians, and like with Palestinian liberation, with Palestinian resistance. And it's so valuable. And I think that we owe it as Palestinians. No matter where you live in the globe, you are probably living on stolen land. And it's really, really important for us to continue to support the Indigenous communities and the other marginalized communities that we live amongst, because no one's going to save us. We have to save ourselves, and we have to save each other. So I just want to echo, like, everything that you're saying. And again, as somebody who's very privileged to have grown up in the Bay Area and grown up around this, like, sometimes it's very lost on me that not everyone has that. Like, even Lena, like, to hear you say that you didn't really like have that connection, that's, again, it's just not something I've used to. So I just definitely appreciate, Razan, you coming on and, giving us all these insights and sharing the importance of this work. I think especially now, as we see the continuation of the genocide in Gaza, it's so important to continue to say this stuff. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, this is real. And that Razan, that was such a beautiful image of like you witnessing land being returned or land being saved ultimately for the Indigenous community in the Bay Area. That must have been such a powerful space to be in and inspiring. And Manny and I were talking about this before the recording. I actually had this question that I wanted to ask you, and I think this is a really natural opportunity to ask you this question. But now that you've seen an example of what this could look like, I want you to kind of envision a liberated future for Palestinians through the lens of Tatreez. What would that look like? What are we wearing? What are we doing? What are we remembering? What are all the things that we can start to imagine as we continue to fight for a liberated Palestine?
It's such a beautiful, beautiful and loaded question. Um, and there's there's the part of me that wants to say, like the cliche romanticize, sitting in the rolling hills, drinking some chai, Tatreezing under the olive trees. Um, and I want all those things, and I want all those things for all Palestinians and all people that are living under occupation. I want to invite everyone over and be like, come to our rolling hills and Tatreez with us under the olive trees. I think that it makes me also think about how Tatreez is so heavily as a practice, like intertwined with our customs and like our social structures, like as Palestinians. Um, I grieved like not having something embroidered or something Palestinian or a piece of gold or an artifact or something when I got married. You know, my mom grieved that she couldn't pass something down to me. And now with Tatreez, we're like actually able to make things. And it's not materialistic because we're talking about really important material cultures that are a reflection and representation of who we are as a people. And so to make that and to pass that down from generation to generation and to be in a liberated Palestine where my children, you know, in my lifetime are wearing the things that I made and my mom has made for them while we're going through this moment right now. This moment that is unlike any other moment in its gravity, in its devastation, but at the same time in its resistance, in the steadfast of the Muslim people. Um, we owe our liberation to them, and it will come in our lifetime. And so, yes, while it may, like we said earlier, feels a little bit guilty sometimes to like sit until trees with everything going on, I try to think about how everything that I'm making is going to survive this moment. And we're going to survive this moment, our children will, and Palestine will be liberated. And we'll get to sit around these things that we have created. And it'll capture what we went through. And that is important. And everyone's story is important in that way. Leave it at that.
Oh my goodness. Amani.
Yeah. Oh, I'm like, thank you so much for everything you're saying. I'm like a complete mess right now. I'm so emotional this week, like, but it's so important everything that you're saying, and it's so beautiful and powerful. And again, I just, oh God, I'm so obsessed with all the work you're doing, and I can't wait to continue to hear it. But I know you're also working on a few other things. So let's talk about what is next on your Tatreez journey. What are some of the other projects that you have in the works right now?
Yes, lots happening. Alhamdulillah. So I am part of an art collective called Firdaus, and we try to really bring art making practice, including Tatreez, into political education. So we're exploring like what that means and what that looks like and being in community with folks around it. So if you're interested in keeping up to date with those different initiatives, you can find us on Instagram, Firdaus, Furdose. And our website is just firdaus.com. And I am also supposed to be working on my PhD. It's not really happening. It goes a lot like that for a lot of people, I would imagine. But it has just shifted a lot. It's about like world making between Palestinian and Indigenous communities. And that felt like way too big, way too abstract. And so it's actually going to be a participatory research project starting next year, where we're bringing folks together from various communities to engage in Tatreez as a way of world making together. And so thinking through yes, how has settler colonialism impacted our lives, for example? But most importantly, how can we intervene on settler colonialism? How can we plan and plot and conspire together and really using Tatreez as a mode of inquiry, as a way of learning, connecting to ancestral knowledge, but also creating things together. That help visually collectively what it means to live in a liberated future. And so if you're interested in getting to know more about my research, I'll pitch my contact information. If you're doing this work, I would absolutely love to hear from you. And that would be really, really great. There's not a lot in the literature that talks about projects like these, but I know that they exist. So if you're someone who's doing them or know of one, please reach out. Yeah, and then the last thing is that I'll be going on a bit of a maternity leave situation, so I might be like offline from social media for a while, when this episode comes out, but I'm happy to stay connected at my Instagram, which is Stitching Liberation. Yeah.
I love it. I love all the things. Razan, you're doing such beautiful, incredible work, and I can't wait to see where it goes. So we will definitely be staying in touch with you. Before we let you go, though, we always like to ask our guests for any major life lessons that you've gained from Tatreez. I'm sure there's a lot, but would love to hear from you.
Yeah, oh my goodness. Um, Tatreez is so humbling.
Truth.
Um, yes. And I was actually recently reading an article by like an Anishinaabe scholar and bead artist, Lana Ray, who her research is very, very similar to, I'm just very inspired by her work and the way that she takes up beadwork. And she has a section in an article called, I think, Beading. I can pull it up just so that everyone could see it. I think beading is a way of life. Beading becomes a part of your life. Where there's a section in the article, she breaks down the different techniques and what she learns from them. And one really stuck with me where she talks about securing a bead and then how that's like a metaphor, but also a practice for being grounded in your values. And then I thought about how we tie a knot as like the first thing we do when we tell trees, and then we string it through, and then that's your anchor point, right? And then you're doing that over and over and over again. And it just reminded me of like steadfastness and like that commitment and that repetitiveness to be so grounded in your values. And Tatreez is so slow that it forces you to really think about these things. And so, yeah, thinking very practically about what it means to Tatreez has really, I think, I don't want to say it has changed my life, but I also think that like I could do a lot better job of implementing the teachings. Not very good at slowing down. I'm
We
not
all
very
can.
good
We
with
all
Yeah,
can.
no shame in
Yeah.
that.
principles are there. It's up to us to put it into practice. And there's
Yeah.
so much that Tatreez has to offer in that regard. Yeah.
Definitely. Oh, thank you so much, Razan. This was just such a valuable conversation. You got me all in my feelings. So thank you for that. But we're really excited to continue to see the work that you do. And I know we're going to talk to you again very soon. So thank you again for your time.
Thank you.
It was such a pleasure to have this conversation with Razan. I am so happy that we were able to catch her. And I feel like she's given me so much hope in a time when it's pretty bad. I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
if there's any time to feel hopeless and helpless, this is one of those times. And the way that she speaks about Tatreez and the way that she speaks about liberation movements is really inspiring and is giving me the energy to kind of keep going, and a reminder that the work that we do is really important, even if it doesn't feel like it's yielding in what we envision to be liberation for Palestine.
Yeah, she definitely had me all in my feelings. So sorry, I probably sound like a idiot talking. I was so moved by everything that she was saying and the work that she's doing. And, even just kind of thinking through as she's talking, thinking about like what we can do, what more we can do as like individuals and as a community, um, So yeah, it's always important to have these conversations, and a good reminder, as you're saying, Lena, like especially right now when things do feel so hopeless, like it's nice to see some positivity in some way. And again, I do want to say, like as I said when we were recording, and even before we started recording, we were talking about this with Razan, but like even with me being so lucky and privileged to have grown up in a community where this type of work was always discussed, and um, it was always work that felt very important and meaningful and interconnected to the work that we as a Palestinian community have always done. It's still important to discuss it on a larger scale. And it's important to continue to push ourselves to do that. And I think, I don't know about you, Lena, but for me, especially with like both workshops, but also with like the 3 circles that we've done locally, like there are a lot more allies that have just continued to come through. And a lot of these allies that come through are from other marginalized communities. And it's really beautiful that they are able to see themselves in our art, and able to see our struggles, intertwined with their struggles for liberation too. There is just something powerful in this idea of, we talk a lot about community, but like looking at a larger community, a community outside of just our Palestinian Tatreez community, because Anglo culture is very heavy on individuality, and most other cultures are not. And there's a reason why, other cultures don't really focus on individuality and focus on community. Not to take away from any of us as individuals, but there's so much power in communities. I'll get off my soapbox now because I think it could just go on and on and on. But again, just such a powerful conversation. Like, please see how you can connect with your local communities, outside of your Palestinian Tatreez community. All of our struggles are intertwined, and it's really important for us to continue to uplift and support each other. So as always, thank you so much for listening to Tatreez Talk. We want to hear about your Tatreez journeys. Please share your stories with us at tatreeztalk@gmail.com, and we might have you on an upcoming episode. Please don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on any of your favorite listening platforms. And of course, be sure to leave us a 5-star review. You can follow me at Min Amani and Lena at Lena Stob. And of course, you could follow the podcast at Tatreez Talk. We'll talk to you soon.